Hey everyone, welcome to Dirk Island. This is the weekend show, and we are talking about the new New York Times weekly show called The Weekly, and the premiere episode about TM Landry, this prep high school in Louisiana that was getting all this media attention with viral videos, like YouTube type videos that were going around the internet of people all huddled around, getting in, being like, you got into Harvard, you got into whatever, and it's these crazy excitement videos that bursted all over. And then the New York Times, this segment is about this investigation that shows that there was so much fake about this. The admissions, the applications themselves, what they were being told to write on the essays, the transcripts. Such a fascinating investigation. Great premiere episode of the New York Times' weekly show, and we will get into it. So the New York Times Weekly, I was really excited just right when this came on. The New York Times, in my book, is one of the most prestigious, well-done papers, media organizations in the world. I feel like they employ a lot of the best journalists there are. I thought it was pretty good, not my favorite. I thought this episode in particular was a little bit too long, a little bit too much focus on the story of making the story, but generally I thought it was pretty good, and I'm excited to keep an eye on this series, although I think my expectations, just by virtue of them being the New York Times, made it so I was coming in with like an 11 out of 10 expectation, and it didn't quite get there, but pretty interesting. I liked it. Okay, I have a very different opinion of it than
Really?
Talking about this specific episode. I was compelled by this story. I thought it was so incredible, and it is one of the reasons why journalism exists and is so important. I think this story is more than just the story that's presented. It's a story that starts really, I would say, with the viral videos. At least that's the entry point for most people. That's what I knew about it before. I remember seeing these viral videos of a room of 50 people huddled around a person at a computer. They were wearing swag of some sort of Ivy League school or some really good school, and then someone would click the computer, and then they'd be really excited, and it'd be like so many people celebrating at the same time, getting into the school. And I think these videos were so compelling. I remember being just compelled by them because I was like, wow, this is great. And I also get what they're trying to do. They're trying to make education, especially like getting into a really great school, like a super cool thing. There's an intent on making it cool, and that I understand why people were hooked by that. But there was something also when I was watching it that felt so fake. What I mean is that I actually did apply to a lot of the schools that people are applying to and getting into this documentary, and I got rejected from a lot of these schools. And getting rejected from a lot of these schools,
I didn't apply to most of them in the first place.
Well, I mean, the reality is that a school like Harvard, only 1 in 10 kids are going to get in, right? Of all of the applications. So, the first question is, well, are you recording these videos for like 10 people and one of them's the success and that's the one you post, and the other 9 have like 50 people around and it would be the most devastating. I can't imagine. I mean, so I went to Penn, great school, but on the same day I got into Penn, I got rejected from 3 other schools. I can tell you, I remember very distinctly the day and the feeling. I was very happy to get into a very good school, but the same day was click, rejection, devastation, extreme devastation, shame, trauma. I mean, it means it means so much to a student at that time, and I didn't have a single person in the room. I wouldn't fucking want a single person in the room. So, and that's what I mean. It didn't ring true to my experience, and not that everyone has the same experience.
You think it could be staged or something?
Yeah, well,
like, how are they doing that?
So,
just mass embarrassment in front of a group of people?
So I assumed, I mean, we watch a lot of unscripted, not just documentary. We watch reality too, or news type content like this. We watch a lot of unscripted. And I assumed it was more unscripted like a reality television show where they knew what was going to happen, but the emotions are real, and they embellished the scenario of it, but basically this person actually did get in, like everything's legit about it. It's just that they set the scene. Maybe there was like, maybe the guidance counselor got a tip and, you know, from the university, like, oh, we're going to let this person in, so you might want to make a video. But that is where the investigation starts. Because if you were to assume something like that even one little element of that video is fake, which almost seems like they have to be in some way, like, then you'd be like, how does an admissions person give a tip to someone? How would anyone be tipped unless the whole thing was staged? So there's something that almost must be off. Now, maybe it's not. Maybe they actually did film a lot of these videos, and a lot of them were people getting rejected, which would be horrific to watch.
There's also, I mean, beyond just the kind of fraudulent nature, you get into the abuse of the Landrys themselves with the kids, which is also kind of a more in-depth thing. I mean, choking students, pushing them up, and he kind of espouses this tough love ideology, but when you get to the base of it, it's like he's traumatizing kids, and there's so much there's even worse stuff going on top of the fraud, which is an interesting element to it as well.
And this is where, when you watch enough of fraud documentaries, you see parallels. There is a lot of parallels between this and the Theranos story, and you might think, oh my god, how the fuck are there any parallels between this? I could see the parallels between this and the like college bribery scandal story, but I don't see how. The reason is because something that seemed incredible, the too good to be true red flags were not going off. You know, I really want this to be true red flags were not going off. That is present for sure in both stories. I really want this to be true. And so that allows maybe people to get a little bit farther with their fraud before getting caught. The culture of fear and intimidation that exists in both, that I think is an element oftentimes of the people who are successful with frauds that get enough to be prominent enough to be something. Because you can be a fucking jackass and get nowhere. You know, you can be a piece of shit who would want a kid to kneel, but unless you got a good fraud and you're getting them to kneel so that they don't squeal on you, and you're asking them to write fake things on their essays, and you're screwing with their transcript, and when they see that they were in Mandarin 3 and they've never taken a day of Chinese in their life, they're like, what? Like, you just, some of these things are a culture of fear would help perpetrate that fraud.
Yeah.
So that's where you see the elements. It surprises you in isolation that, oh, it's fucked up in this way, and it's also fucked up in this way. And it's like, actually, it seems like there's a nice poisonous boil that you throw in all the different poisonous ingredients, and you get yourself a real good poisonous stew going on. And so that's what I mean, you know, when we watch enough of these.
Yeah, and something I liked, which you've kind of talked, there were some cracks in the facade. You know, you noticed it with those acceptance videos. There's something a little off. And a couple of my favorite scenes from this episode, the reporter hops on the phone with Landry himself. You know, one of the two, there's a couple that runs the school. The man who's kind of the abuser or the accused abuser is willing to hop on the phone to defend his program. Like, he's willing to kind of put his face out there and try to speak on behalf of his school. She starts asking him about the the accusations of him abusing, and he reveals an earlier story that they didn't even know about, of him choking someone and making kids kneel. And it's so great because he kind of feels he's convincing her. He seems like the con man who thinks his spiel is going well. Yeah. This is a New York Times reporter, obviously probably one of the best like callers of bullshit there is, and hangs up the phone, and you see this, they kind of tell the story of telling the story, and she's like, okay, like, this is real. You know, hangs up with him and is like, this is real, after talking to him for a couple minutes. And then there's another kind of, you know, speaking of spidey senses moment, where she goes into the school and Landry's like showing them around, like, oh, look at all, and he's got his like star puppet, you know, students there with, not that the students are, but his star students who will speak well on behalf of the school.
Of him, and he can point at them and go, your ACT score, your ACT score, your ACT score, which is, that is also would be traumatizing to have someone yell at you if you're, at least in my experience. I get that everyone has different experiences, but you would not, that's like private information, what you get on the SAT or the ACT. I cannot imagine a school administrator pointing and yelling and asking people to say in a room what their scores are, as if that's I mean, I get he was developing some sort of different culture where people were opening up their acceptances and having 50 people around to presumably see them not get in, but probably not. There was probably something a little bit baked about that, but still.
Yeah, it's alarming, right? It puts you off. And then he does another thing, which was really interesting, which is, I can't remember the word. It's like hello or some like thing. He'll go, you know, this, and they yell out, and it's a call and response, like a disciplinary thing. And he goes, in English, in Spanish, in Chinese, in Russian. And it's a total like fraud spidey senses tingling, because being able to teach your students one word in 10 different languages is totally like a fraudster's or like a non-intellectual's version of displaying intelligence. You know what I mean?
It's usable for proof of cleverness and not for cleverness itself.
Exactly. Whereas like most true academics and most teachers, I think, would be offended by the idea of summing up your students by their ACT scores, and wouldn't think that it's impressive to just rattle off some memorization task. They believe in like diving into materials, reading and synthesizing things, and drawing conclusions. Like critical thinking skills is what I would say most academics would value in their students, and they certainly wouldn't view them as like being able to rattle off quick tricks or say summing them up by their ACT scores. It's just totally, it's just one of the greatest moments, because it goes to what you're saying, which is, even though there's this veneer of the great school with these standout performances and college acceptances in an area in Louisiana that doesn't see these results, has kids who aren't getting good education opportunities. So there's that veneer, but what this is so great at doing is showing you kind of those moments that I'm sure is how they got a tip also from someone in the Justice Department, but surely they started looking into it and their spidey senses were tingling. And it's so great that this Landry character is kind of the total fraudster, where he feels like, oh yeah, I'm going to parade my students right in front of you and show you my parlor tricks, and it's just going to convince you. And it's like, not with a fucking New York Times person. Not going to work. They've already investigated.
I hate to say this. He hasn't been convicted of anything. So, I mean, there is the caveat that perhaps there is an explanation for all of the things, like how someone gets Chinese put on their transcript when they never took Chinese in their life, or how they got 1 GPA, or say they were told to lie about something on their essays or whatever.
Luckily, I don't have to be as disciplined as they do, but I'm like, he totally, I mean, you're not like,
it's convincing you of what's going on, and I think the FBI is going to reveal more about it as time goes on. But it is funny where you find out what some people think they can trick you into, and you're like, you understand that I'm like smart and capable of not believing what you're saying, right? Like some people I don't know, it's like hilarious. They're like, no, I can just like forcefully say something and you will believe it. And it's like, it just doesn't work. This doesn't work on some people, like journalists, like real journalists, So anyway, that is a funny moment to kind of, his defense is almost like, no, he did it for sure. Like they know, because there's just some people you just can't keep tricking. The one other thing I was saying is the story itself is, as I said, kind of similar to Theranos, where you have these things where you want to be true. I think that when I saw the viral videos, it played on a wavelength that I understood, which is, I can see why someone's doing this. I think this is great to promote education in the way that people are promoting maybe sports or other, fame, like, Instagram fame or whatever people promote in our society, to promote through the same, play on the playing field of viral videos, but promote something good like educational accomplishment. That's great. But the fact that we could probably tell if we used our basically just continue asking like, why? That doesn't quite make sense. How is it that you get 50 people into a room to watch someone do this? Are they going to show us that there are 9 other videos where people get rejected? If not, what's happening? Is it that everyone in the room is being invited because the person already opened their thing, because that actually doesn't seem like what happened. It seems like the student is actually not sure. Maybe they're acting. But if, let's say, they're not acting, then how did the person know to put the camera on the student and invite all the people that time without creating 9 out of 10 traumatic situations, right? Because you assume they're not actually having those rejection videos that don't go to air. Most, if not all, are fait accompli. You know what's going to happen. The person's getting in, but how? So is it that the admission advisor talked to the guy from TM Landry? This is all hypothetical, but basically exploring the mental path you'd have to go down to really go, wait, if we used our best judgments, we might be able to get closer to this sooner. Which is that, how would they know that? Well, was the admissions person from Harvard calling him and saying, or was he calling them and going, can you just let me know, because like we'll make a viral video, and that, or like, because I want to do that, but I don't want to make these videos on kids if they're gonna not get into Harvard, and maybe someone's giving them tips. Is that allowed? If someone who is an admissions officer knew that that one particular admission would go into a viral video versus someone else's admission would not go into a viral video, would that change who they decided to admit versus deny? There's so many moral implications if you really follow this down the rabbit hole, which is that, wait a second, something had to be off. Even in the New York Times story, we don't know what was off, how they pulled off those videos. We do not know. And I still think that is an interesting part of the story that I would be more curious about, because is it that an admissions officer was tipping off anybody for this? I mean, that may not be an element. It may be that they just all faked it. They knew the answer already, and they had already gotten in the day before, and then they do the video the day after. But if they didn't do that, then how would you know that you weren't going to be setting someone up for the most embarrassment they've ever had in their life? So if they're doing this, would that create different incentives? It does. It could expose the colleges themselves to potentially at least some admissions officers with perhaps some culpability involved. It's just unclear at this point. And so I think that our best judgment, though, are the initial intake of like, how could you pull off this viral video? Just like you watch lots of prank videos online, and you must know that a lot of prank videos are fake. I mean, that's like a lot of what's fun, but a lot of things that you see online are fake. A lot of reality things are set up in a way, and sometimes it's trivial of what's happening. But in this case, it's not at all. And knowing really what's fake and what's not is important. And I think that, it's interesting because it played on the viral video culture, but it also imported a little element that oftentimes some YouTubers admit to, that their vlogs aren't entirely real. Some of the things that are going on are a bit fabricated. It's almost like a bit of a reality show where they are a bit acting and being themselves at the same time. And so I think it's just interesting. But if we had made more of those assumptions, if we had kind of questioned a bit more, perhaps you would stop some of the stuffing a little bit earlier, I guess. But then again, the worst conclusion of that is then you've got to start questioning what seems like just a great good. Wouldn't it be great if this existed and was completely legit? Same with Theranos. Wouldn't it be fucking great if a single prick of blood did all of these tests and you never had to do all the tubes over and over again? Wouldn't so many of these things be great? And we were played. And it's tough, because that is a maybe it's a modern theme in a way. It's a way to play us,
Yeah, I mean, the theme that comes to mind, which we've talked about before, is that, the truth does matter, at the end of the day, which is, and I kind of wanted to go out on a limb here because, you seem to have the same impression as I did going into this series, which is New York Times, it's going to be good shit. It's credible. And I couldn't help but think about the fact that Donald Trump will be like the shitty New York Times. Or like I hear Ben Shapiro kind of say, the fake news. And it made me think about this concept of framing, which is like a communication concept. And I will admit, and I have read a New York Times article and been frustrated because of framing for it.
Yeah, I just read one today, and we can talk about it today, that I thought was difficult. But
yeah,
keep going.
So yeah, and just to quickly give my kind of basic definition of framing, it's like Donald Trump winning the election. You could have a headline that's something along the lines of, despite all polls saying otherwise, Donald Trump triumphs in the election. Or you could say, despite losing the popular vote, Donald Trump is elected, right? Same story. Both are technically factual, but the framing is different. So I have read New York Times articles that the framing is irritating to me because I'm like, why did they choose to frame it that way? But on the other, so that is one thing to admit. You can critique something like the New York Times and it's fair. But just what I think we're losing is for every intellectually honest person, you should also realize that just because you can make that critique does not mean that they're not one of the most credible, high-quality news organizations in the world, and that we should all have a basic sense that, like, the New York Times is a citable, legit news organization. And just because there are problems of framing, which are pretty much unavoidable, and it's just something that came up because I feel we've lost this, or at least in the public discourse. Even the New York Times is getting attacked, which critiques are fine, but to attack the credibility is what I find so it's offensive a little bit to modern sensibilities, because without the trust in an organization like the New York Times, we just don't have any common ground. Because you have to admit that if this isn't good enough caliber for you to believe in the basic, they're fact checking, they mean to get the truth out, these people are intelligent, they are not intentionally they care about truth.
But what they do often in these is it's not just the story that you might read. It's not what you're polling at any time, even if it's a New York Times version that's more high quality than maybe if you're just reading other sources. But it's a lot of interviews with the person who polled the story. What that reveals is both good for the New York Times and potentially harmful. And you see this in this episode of The Weekly. A journalist, if you're not aware, is a real person. And that is very obvious. They have to show the real person. And real people are not actually objective robots like some would pretend like someone has to be when they're being a news provider, right? I mean, I personally try to stay pretty objective for a preference reason, which is that it keeps me able to see other angles and analyze them. But but you can't be totally objective, but you can have a goal, which is the truth, which is getting out the truth. So in this thing, you see the two main journalists who pull the story, who find the story before they go out public with it and afterwards too. And they deliver the story that is a troubling story, because it does have this potential. It can be potentially used by people who want to be essentially just racists. It's a story that could be put into a racist feather cap to be like, aha, and it was fake here when the black kids were getting into school. And the journalists who are writing the story know that that is a possible use of their own story. And I think that that is always a risk with journalism, but it doesn't stop them from getting at the truth. Just because someone's going to go out there and take their little thing, they were just trying to report something, and turn it into a dagger and try to stab someone else with it in their frickin' culture wars that they're going after. That's why, we get to see that the two people reporting on the story do care very much about it. They do not want these kids who were told to kneel, told to lie on their essays, potentially complicit with fake transcripts being sent on their behalf and not really knowing. They don't really want these kids to get now pulled out of the Harvards of the world or whatever school they got in, because they do believe that these kids actually are legit and were good students and did get good ACT scores and do deserve an education. And perhaps, they did take someone else's spot. It's very morally complicated, just to be real about it. It doesn't appear that the students who were the beneficiaries, just the same way as the other college scandal that was going on with these parents who were probably just trying to impress other wealthy people by getting, my kid going here, my kid's going here, and they're bribing their way to get their kids into schools whether or not the kids knew about it. But the kids are probably not the perpetrators, probably another victim in the whole scheme. And the journalists are very conscious of that. They don't want to break the story and then have all of these kids from TM Landry suddenly get expelled from these great schools that some of them maybe are doing very well in, some of them maybe are not, not doing well in because their transcripts were faked, and and so they weren't actually prepared because the school was not actually preparing them well for college. So there's a lot, but there's still a victim in that case, which is the trouble. You don't want to further punish that kid who was denied a high school education, now is having trouble in college, was getting, and what do you want to do? Take that away from them now? What they need is they always wanted education. That's why they went to the school in the first place. So anyway,
luckily it seemed like the universities and the reporters both were on the same page with that, and no kids were expelled after the story, which, to the journalists' credit, they were genuinely concerned and made that a story point. It's we want to break this story and get to the truth, but we don't want to ruin these kids' future, which was kind of an interesting angle.
So you realize that the political or the whatever a journalist is, journalists do have real interests, whether or not they're on the left or the right or whatever. They do have interest in how they tell a story, how it's used. I mean, I've written things, as you know, and you can have something that you write get turned into a dagger. There's the best analogy I can say. I've written about polls before, poll results and things like that. You can have someone take your thing and try to stab someone with it. Oh, yeah, I just read this, so fuck you. Now I hate this whole group of people because I read a poll about them.
Yeah,
people want to do this all the time.
Shockingly so.
Both about everyone's supporters, Trump supporters, Bernie supporters, other Hillary supporters, whatever the fuck it is. They want to take this shit and one group versus another. Everyone's just fucking wants to take shit and turn into a dagger. It's what's happening online. It's a bit unfortunate, but it doesn't stop the value of the truth. And you can't. It's a naive to pretend that the world needs to have journalists that don't have any sort of interests, and that would somehow conflict with them being good journalists. They can be good journalists, just like a judge can have real opinions about the world and also apply the law. Why, Trump's comment, this judge with Mexican parents can't rule fairly on me because I want to limit Mexican immigration, was such an attack on our system, which is that no, a judge can be fair. It doesn't matter what his ethnicity is, even if he perceived that you were anti-Mexican, a judge can still be fair. This is the world that we should believe that humans can operate in. At least people like judges or journalists at very good organizations. I mean, at least I believe that. So, hey everyone, welcome back to Dirk Island. This segment is worth watching. We're talking this week about the New York Times new show, The Weekly, which airs on FX and Hulu. And we just watched the premiere episode on TM Landry, the scandal about those viral acceptance videos where those kids are around and they get accepted to schools like Harvard, and it's this crazy thing. But the New York Times did this really interesting expose about how there was abuse at the schools, and the stuff that they were being told to put on their applications wasn't true, or at least in a lot of cases wasn't. And there's now there's an FBI investigation. There's probably going to be more to the story in the future, but it's really the behind the scenes, the version of the daily podcast that is going to be now a video version. You get to know the journalists covering the story before the story breaks, some of the aftermath of this story. Really interesting view, very interesting story. What's your conclusion?
I'm going to give it a solid 7, probably worth it. I have super high hopes for this series in general. Love the New York Times. I'm a regular Vice HBO watcher, and this is kind of in that vein, and really quality content. Good opening graphics, just the style, the production quality, and the reporting quality are top notch. This, I will have to admit, I gave it a 7 because I'm frankly totally spoiled when it comes to unscripted content. We've seen so many good documentaries, so many good, Vice on HBO content, so many good doc series that have really complete stories. And this one, and you mentioned there's an ongoing FBI investigation into the Landrys and this unaccredited school in Louisiana. So that, I think, is what for me felt a little missing and why this was too long. Like, it was a full episode and I was just expecting that completed story when really this story doesn't have an end. I'm used to it where it's like, we find the school with the promising acceptance. We uncover the fraud. We catch the douche, the Landry guy red-handed, and then the investigation turns up and he's prosecuted. Like, slam dunk completion, like a full total package. And the reality of the New York Times is like, they're an ongoing reporting thing, and that's what this seems more like. So it just felt like, for being an entire episode, there wasn't as much as I'm accustomed to getting in terms of like a complete story and really deep, rich characters. It felt more like a Vice News Tonight scope of story extended over a whole episode, and so that's what I didn't like. To be fair, my expectations are like very high, but that's kind of what I want from New York Times Weekly.
Yeah. So I would give it a 7 also. I think that it was a very like good start, a really interesting story. Obviously it makes you think a lot of other things, and there are things that you want from the story that you don't get, which is like kind of you just can't. And also the nature of this, I would just say, for a recommendation for people watching, this fits into a slightly different category than the other kind of medium form news video sources. So as we're talking about, Vice has 2 formats: News Tonight, which has some little bit-sized stories, maybe up to 10 minutes, and some, and then the Vice itself, and then sometimes Vice specials, which are almost like 2-hour documentaries. The Vice Weekly show has usually more fully baked stories, but closer to like a 60 minutes or a real sports format, where you're talking about, you've got some interview, you've got it covering something. A lot of times it is foreign territory. The New York Times, The Weekly Show, is a real longer version of The Daily, which is the daily podcast. It's not any of those things. It is something different, which is what it does, like The Daily, which very few news stories do, is it makes the reporters themselves part of the story. It's more of part of the watching of this is seeing how the story is uncovered, which is in itself inherently interesting and not usually shown in news programs, and then seeing how it is reacted to, because these are big breaking stories in the New York Times, which when they break, millions and millions of people watch. So it's kind of like Icarus. Icarus has that element to it where you see the story of the Russian, doctor going with the documentarian. They bring all their data and evidence to the New York Times. It breaks, and then you see the aftermath. It's like that, but on a smaller basis, on a regular interval. So you see them develop the story, and that does have its own inherent interest. You see the journalist asking the question, the guy giving them the answer, them going, what he's saying is basically not credible, and you see it developing. So there's a bit more of almost like a cooking show aspect to it, where you're seeing the story, these breaking stories that have already broken the New York Times. You're seeing them developed and then reacted to, and that there's more to it. So I think it serves a different function in your unscripted, maybe news learning format. You can definitely learn about the T.M. Landry story through watching The Weekly, if you prefer to watch a piece of video versus reading the story itself. But if you're a New York Times reader, you might have already read this story. It's like, I could imagine them doing it on the other college admission scandal, which is the one with all the parents and that investigation and paying and bribing people to say that they were in some sport when they never played that sport in their life. That you could see a weekly episode being done on that and the development of those stories or other stories. And I'm excited to see what stories are out there, but I think this serves a different purpose. It's not just telling you the story like you might get on 60 Minutes or you might get on Vice. It's showing a bit more of the development of the story and the reaction too. And so there's a behind the scenes element to it. And I think it's a really interesting way to consume news. I'm very hopeful for the series. It's not. There are some more polished things that you get from the real sports segments that you get from the Vice News weekly show segments that have this very polished, wholly complete element to it that you might feel a bit unsatisfied watching the New York Times The Weekly, but you're going to get a different element from the weekly. You're going to get an element of storytelling that is not existing in those other unscripted kind of short documentary short formats. So I think this is worth watching, or at least probably worth watching. I hope that the next episodes are great too, and that's where I think we can leave it. Thanks very much for watching us. Please subscribe on YouTube if you want to keep up and learn about more documentaries that we're watching, and also you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts if you want to listen to the audio version. Thanks very much.
Thanks.